Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, as always, for joining me here on the American Bar Association's Division for Public Education's Twitter feed. I am pleased, as always, to be joined by Professor Stephen D. Schwinn of UIC John Marshall's Law School here in Chicago. Professor Schwinn, thank you as always.
Thanks for having me, Kathy. It's good to be with you again.
So, since the last time we were together, there has been a pretty big decision coming out of the court on the Trump versus New York census case. The last time we spoke, we were questioning what was going on with the timing of that case. Would we get a ruling before the end of the year? We certainly did. And I think we're going to spend a little bit of time today unpacking that ruling, talking about what it could mean for some broader implications, and maybe providing some ways teachers may be able to think about this case with their students. So Steve, to get us started, can you talk just a little bit about how this case got to the court? What was the background and what were the justices wrestling with?
Sure. And Kathy, here I'm going to rewind a couple of years and start with an initial decision of the Trump administration to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census form. We might remember that the Trump administration had determined that it wanted to add the citizenship question to the census form, but it didn't really have a good reason for doing so. And so plaintiffs challenged the decision to add the citizenship question to the census form in court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And that's what the Supreme Court said. The Supreme Court said, look, you may be able to do this, but you've got to articulate a good reason for why you want to do it. And the reason that you articulated is simply not good enough. And so the court said no citizenship question on the census unless and until you can come back with a better reason. Now, the reason that I mention that is because pretty transparently, what the Trump administration was trying to do is to discourage unauthorized aliens or people that might be affiliated with them from filling out their census forms, to depress the census count so that only authorized individuals in the country, that would include citizens and authorized aliens, would be counted in the census. That gambit didn't work. And so then President Trump came back in the summer 2020, just this past summer, and issued a memo to the Secretary of Commerce that said, Secretary, when you report the raw census numbers to me as president, I also want you to report a second set of numbers. The second set of numbers will be the total number of unauthorized non-citizens in the country. And what President Trump said that he was going to do then is to discount the total number based on the census by the number of unauthorized non-citizens in the country for the purpose of determining the apportionment of seats in the House of Representatives to Congress. So the way this works is the president will sit down and just run the math, right? And basically figure out, based on population from state to state and how it has shifted since the last census in 2010, how do we apportion seats now in the House of Representatives, which then also obviously affects apportionment for the purpose of the Electoral College, and also could affect a whole number of federal programs that are tied to the census numbers in a state or local jurisdiction. So a wide variety of federal spending programs are tied to these numbers. So it can affect the amount of money these jurisdictions receive as well. States, local governments, and advocates sued the Trump administration and said, well, you can't do that. You can't do it because the Constitution itself says that the census needs to count the whole number of persons. Federal law similarly says you need to count the whole number of persons in the United States. Oh, and by the way, we have always counted the whole number of persons in the United States in every census that we've ever conducted. So long as they had a usual residence here in the United States. That's really the touchstone. So they sued. The case went to the Supreme Court, and an oral argument. The oral argument, as we've discussed a little bit, was really weird, right? So the government comes and says, well, we actually don't know if we're going to be able to count the number of unauthorized non-citizens in the country to report them to the president ever, certainly by the December 31st deadline. So we just don't know if we can do this. And And as it turns out, that's basically what the court said on Friday. What the court said is there's too much uncertainty in this case. Whether the government will be able to come up with these numbers and report an altered apportionment to Congress in the way that we discussed, whether the government will be able to do that at all is entirely uncertain at this point, which means that the case is not ripe for review before the court, and that the plaintiffs were unable to establish the kind of harm that a court looks for in determining whether a plaintiff has standing to sue in the first place. In short, the court punted. It didn't get to the core issue. It said, the case is not justiciable. It doesn't belong in court, at least not yet.
Thank you, Steve. I think you gave a wonderful overview to really understand the context of this case, because I think in what the court did, it picked a really narrow way to approach this issue and to look specifically at sort of what happened at argument and this focus on the uncertainty. But there is a larger context that we all recognize that this case is a part of. And I think we have to sort of take a step back when looking at this decision and understand how this impacts the entire census count and what that means going forward. I was curious if you could talk a little bit. So it's a 6-3 decision. As you mentioned, the majority was indicating that they felt that this case was both sort of too soon, but also not quite ready, not almost too late at the same time. What were the dissenting 3 justices interested in, and how would they have approached the case?
So this was kind of interesting too, just the head count on the court. So now you've got 6 conventionally considered conservative justices, right, that were in the majority in the case, and you've got the 3 progressives in dissent. So Justice Breyer writes for himself, and Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan. What Breyer said is, look, the majority gets it wrong on justiciability. There actually is standing in the case, and the case is ripe. And the reason why is because the president was quite clear about what the president intended to do. And so we take the president at his word. He's going to do this, and it will result in the kind of harm that the plaintiffs have alleged. And so let's go ahead and hear the case. But then Breyer went on and also discussed the merits of the case. What Justice Breyer said was what I alluded to earlier, both the Constitution and federal law, and here he really focuses just on federal law in order to avoid the constitutional question. What he says is both of those sources of law say that the census has to count everybody in the United States, the whole persons, a whole number of people in the United States. And by discounting the whole number by the number of unauthorized aliens, the government is not complying with that mandate. So Justice Breyer would not only have heard the case, said that it was justiciable, but also ruled against the government. Now, at oral argument, there was a good suggestion that at least 2 other justices, if the court got to the merits, would have agreed with Justice Breyer. Those are Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Barrett. They both indicated that the plaintiffs had a really strong legal case here and indicated that they might well go with Justice Breyer on the merits. And indeed, the other justices might as well. We just don't know. They didn't send strong enough signals at oral argument. But the upshot is that the court's not going to hear the case now. Now, the ruling does leave open a possibility that that plaintiffs can come back and sue if President Trump actually does what his memo instructs the Secretary of Commerce to do, what he intends to do. And Dale Ho, the attorney for the ACLU who argued the case at the Supreme Court, has already indicated that they'll refile the case if that happens.
Is there enough time, Steve? I mean, we get a new administration halfway through January. Do we see this making? It feels like the census has been ongoing during the Trump administration, and these challenges with the Supreme Court are just sort of constant, or the lower court challenges that we've seen continuing. And so what happens if you can put your prediction hat on? What happens in the next 6 weeks with the census, and when we have a Biden administration coming in? Does this just all change course midstream?
Yeah, so there are a number of possibilities here. One possibility is that President Trump actually goes through with his plan either before December 31st, which is the statutory deadline, or sometime before January 20th when President Biden is sworn in. If if President Trump does that, it will undoubtedly draw lawsuits, right? But the other possibility here is that the House of Representatives, the clerk of the House of Representatives, could simply reject the count and say, this is an unreliable count, we're not going to take it, and put it over to the Biden administration, which then presumably would give the full head count to the House of Representatives. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is that the Trump administration doesn't go through with its plan because, as you, I think, really well stated, this case is both too early and too late, right? The timing here is really weird. So if the Trump administration doesn't go through with its plan, then I think the whole census question spills over into the Biden administration. And I would expect that the Biden administration does not discount the whole number of people by the number of unauthorized aliens the way the Trump administration has proposed. So I think the Biden, then the ball would be in the Biden administration's court. What's most likely? I've given up predicting the way things are going to work in both the Trump administration and at the Supreme Court. I really have no idea. Kathy, I'm a little curious. What are some of the aspects of the opinion that drew your attention, or aspects of the case in general?
Yeah, I think it's just that it's the too soon and also too late, which coming out of the oral argument, I felt the same way. And in reading this decision, I also felt that. And what I mean by that is it's the too soon because the administration has not excluded the unauthorized non-citizens from the count. So that hasn't happened yet. But it's also the too late in that we've had a huge run up to the actual counting of the census that really was, I think there is some belief that it was an intentional attempt to depress the number of people who were turning in their form and asking to be counted, or understanding that their count would count, that they're raising their hand and saying, I'm here, would count towards the final number. And one of the things I'm really curious is, and I think this is going to be a question we won't know the answer for many years, but whatever the results that we actually get from the census, how well does that really match what activists and community advocates know is representative of their communities? And was this sort of year-long battle actually impactful in maybe potentially lowering the census count? And I think a lot of teachers quite rightly spend the years leading up to the census talking to their students about why the census is important and what it means. And you see all these public service announcements about the importance of raising your hand. And we won't get this chance again for another decade. And what does that mean to certain communities over the next 10 years? I think it'll be a question we have to reckon with for quite some time. So that's the too late side of things. The too soon side of things was really this idea that the administration, particularly during oral argument, just said, we don't know how we're going to be able to exclude these people. We don't know how many people we're going to exclude because of it. And there was some discussion between the justices and the advocates about the exact number. And was it going to be a small number or hundreds of thousands? And that was really one of the things that felt like the majority was glomming onto, that this uncertainty was why the case was not appropriately before the court. And normally uncertainty is something the court doesn't like. They like the facts, they're an appellate court by nature. They like the facts to have been determined before it gets to them. But I think in some of this, the administration saying we want to do this plan, but it's an uncertain plan, was sort of surprising and unexpected in a year that has, or many years before the court, that have had a lot of unexpected or surprising things happen. And I was surprised to see the court really relying on that uncertainty as the reason it was, as you said, effectively punting this one.
Yeah, I was really surprised about that aspect of the case as well. I mean, both surprised and not surprised, I suppose. But, a cynic might say that the Trump administration was gaming this, right? And that President Trump issued his memo very late in the game over the summer, with the full knowledge that we would be at this point of uncertainty by the time the case got to the Supreme Court, and that the administration could use the uncertainty to get the court not to rule on the underlying merits, and then yet nevertheless go through with the scheme on an abbreviated timescale. Now, whether that was actually going on or not, I have no idea. But given some of the other unusual moves with regard to the census over the last couple of years, we've got to put this in that larger context.
The one thing I think will be really interesting to track students who are studying this right now or who are having this as part of their social studies classes. I mean, I remember like learning about the census, but it was sort of something my parents did, and then it was gone and out of sight, out of mind. And I think this has really made the census a front and center issue for certain communities of students and in general as a unit in a social studies classroom. And I do wonder if it's something that an entire generation is going to pay much closer attention to in 10 years from now, when it's them filling out the forms, they're having the opportunity to interact with it, and what it means and how this apportionment actually plays out.
I certainly hope so, because the census is so important. We only think about it once every 10 years, but we ought to think about it really hard and be sure to participate because it is so important. Just on that point, Kathy, what do you do with this in the classroom?
Yeah, so I think there's been a ton of great resources coming out on how to work with the census with students. And I think this particular case is just such an odd case. And really throws into question how these numbers are all counted, what's pulled out, what's included, that the case itself provides sort of a jumping off point to allow you to almost blow up the system, for lack of a better term. Yeah. So one of the things I would have students do is start from scratch and do a mock congressional session, have students represent different points of view, different community organizations, and how do you do this if you're starting brand new? So there's no 10-year census. Apportionment has not been happening the way it's been happening before. How do you make these decisions about representation, about federal funding? How do you weigh these considerations? How often do you review it? Because I think the 10 years thing feels very, very long, but it's also very expensive and time consuming and is not a snap of the fingers. But maybe students come up with plans where there's something on your cell phone that you're clicking every 18 months to say, this is where I live. But really having students sort of flex their creativity and look across all aspects of the federal government as to how we could reimagine this entire system, I think would be really interesting. The other thing I would maybe encourage teachers to do is approach this with a structured academic controversy. So, ask them, should unauthorized non-citizens be included in the census count? Have them assign them their yes or no, have them work with a partner through a guided reading, identify the strongest arguments, present those in small groups, and then swap. So you're not asking students to weigh it themselves. You're not asking them to pick their own position and justify it, which I think for some of these issues can become really personal really fast for a lot of students. But you're asking them to think critically about the arguments and then also put the other side's hat on. Because I do think that, particularly as we saw during oral argument, there was no, as you said, some of the justices tipped their hand that they may vote a certain way. And this is one where putting a different lens on it, I think, would be really instructive for students. If you were doing a structured academic controversy, we've taken the article you did for the ABA Supreme Court preview and made it one of our preview in the classroom features. So it's a classroom ready resource that a teacher could scale and really highlight some of those arguments and use them for their students. So those are just fantastic. A couple ideas that I would have. Steve, I know you've thought a little bit about this and placed it within the context of the 14th Amendment. How do you approach this with your students or with teachers that you'd be working with?
Yeah, sure. I love those ideas, Kathy, and I think they mesh well with some of the ways that I've been thinking about the case. We have a history in the United States, as I mentioned, of counting everybody in the United States for the purpose of the census, the whole persons, right? But that itself has a history. So in the original text of the Constitution, we counted whole persons, but not Indians not taxed is the language in the text, and counted slaves as 3/5 of a person. When the 14th Amendment, we dropped the 3/5 clause, still counted the whole number of persons without Indians not taxed, again, the language of the text. But this opens up a really interesting opportunity to have a conversation about the nature of citizenship, who counts in a democracy, who's taxed, who's represented in a democracy, who gets to vote in a democracy, and how we should apportion seats both in Congress and in the state legislatures, because of course state legislatures will use the census data as well to draw their districts. It also occurred to me that at a more basic level, we could do just a simple math lesson around this, right? What does it mean to apportion seats based on the whole number of persons, based on the whole number of persons minus unauthorized aliens? And what does that mean for a state like California, for example, where the estimates that they could lose up to 2 to 3 congressional seats if President Trump had his way?
Yeah, I appreciated your reminders. We were putting the preview and the classroom materials together that this is a zero-sum game. There's not more House of Representatives members created. So if one state or one area gets an increase, that means someone else is at a loss, which I think is a really interesting conversation in our democracy. And how do you weigh those?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, Professor Schwen, thank you as always for joining us. I appreciate the time you've made available to us this fall and look forward to transitioning into the latter half of the Supreme Court term with you and continuing these discussions. And I hope you and your family have a lovely holiday season.
Thanks so much, Kathy. You too. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.